The boardroom was silent except for the faint hum of the projector. A PowerPoint slide glowed against the white wall. Employee review, Elliot Brandt. My name looked stark and clinical under the fluorescent lights, like evidence at a crime scene. CEO Mason Corrick sat at the head of the table, not even looking at me as he spoke. You've been underperforming for months, Elliot. The numbers don't lie. 3 directors shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The HR rep, Angela, stared at her notepad like it contained secrets she couldn't share. Nobody would meet my eyes. My voice cracked once, only once, as I asked, underperforming? You mean the deals that kept this company in the black last quarter? Mason clicked to the next slide without answering. Charts appeared, data I'd never seen before, numbers that told a story I didn't recognize. Cherry-picked statistics designed to paint me as dead weight. Every graph was a carefully constructed lie. When I saw security waiting outside through the glass door, the realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a performance discussion. This was a setup, planned and executed with precision. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. My name is Elliot Brandt, 34 years old, and that was the moment I learned loyalty meant nothing in the world I'd helped build. They made me walk through the office. The long walk past cubicles where people I'd worked with for 6 years suddenly found urgent reasons to stare at their computer screens. Conversations died mid-sentence as I passed. Keyboards went silent. An intern I'd trained last summer whispered to her neighbor, loud enough for me to hear, "He's the guy who lost Mason the big deal." I wanted to scream the truth, to grab her shoulders and explain that every deal she'd heard about had my fingerprints all over it. But something in me stayed still, controlled, quiet. Let them think what they wanted. Let them believe Mason's carefully constructed narrative. Mason stood in his glass corner office watching my exit, arms folded across his chest like a king surveying an execution he'd ordered. His expression was calm, satisfied, victorious. I made eye contact once as I passed. Held his gaze for 3 seconds. He looked away first, turning to his computer screen with forced casualness. That's when I decided. I wouldn't fight loud. I wouldn't beg or plead or make scenes that would be whispered about in break rooms. I'd fight smart, quiet, methodical. The way I'd always worked. The way Mason had never learned to work. 6 months earlier, everything had been different. Mason had just been promoted to CEO after the previous one, Harold Vance, retired to spend time with his grandchildren. The announcement came during an all-hands meeting where Mason gave a speech about vision and innovation and taking Glenrock Capital to new heights. That same afternoon, he called me into his office. The space still smelled like Harold's pipe tobacco, though Mason had already replaced the mahogany desk with something modern and cold. "Elliot, you're my anchor," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "You understand the numbers like no one else here. Your instincts for profitable investments are what's going to carry this company forward." I believed him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. After 3 years of proving myself, of working 80-hour weeks, of saving deals that other analysts had written off, I thought I'd finally found someone who saw my value. We spent nights together in the office, crunching data for potential acquisitions, building models that predicted market shifts. Mason would bring coffee at midnight, ask questions, take notes on everything I explained. He called me his secret weapon. But once the spotlight turned on him, once investors started praising his leadership, I slowly disappeared from the credits. The erasure started small, so subtle I almost missed it. One morning, 3 months into Mason's tenure as CEO, a company newsletter landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Mason Corrick's top 5 wins of the quarter." I opened it with my coffee still steaming, expecting maybe to see my name mentioned as part of the team. Instead, I found 5 deals listed under Mason's accomplishments. Every single one had been mine. Every contract bore my signature on the original documents, every financial model had been built by me, every client relationship had been cultivated through my calls and meetings. Now they were his victories, presented as evidence of his bold vision and decisive leadership. I scrolled through the email 3 times, my chest burning with something between disbelief and rage. Surely this was a mistake. Someone in marketing had gotten confused about who'd led which projects. When I found our marketing lead, Vanessa, at the coffee station, I kept my voice casual. "Hey, about the newsletter. Those deals listed under Mason's wins, I actually led most of those projects." She shrugged without looking at me. "Mason said you were just assisting on those. He wanted to make sure the company understood his strategic direction." Just assisting. The words echoed in my head for the rest of the day. That was the first time I realized I wasn't being overlooked. I was being actively erased. The Harlan Manufacturing acquisition was supposed to be my breakthrough moment. The deal involved $42 million in assets, a struggling company with solid fundamentals that just needed proper management. Every other analyst at Glenrock had passed on it, seeing only the surface problems without recognizing the potential underneath. I spent 3 months on that acquisition. Every negotiation with Harlan's board, every clause in the contract, every financial model predicting returns, all mine. I'd worked weekends, missed my anniversary dinner, practically lived at the office ensuring every detail was perfect. When the deal closed and projections showed we'd double investor returns within 18 months, Mason called me into his office. "Elliot, this is brilliant work. Seriously, you've outdone yourself." He shook my hand, genuine warmth in his expression. For a moment, I felt valued, seen, appreciated. That same evening, Mason presented the Harlan deal at an investor dinner as his bold vision, his instinctive understanding of undervalued assets, his strategic genius. My name never came up. Not once. My wife Claire poured me a drink when I got home and said quietly, "He's using you, Elliot. You know that, right?" I'd laughed it off then, defending Mason, explaining how corporate credit worked. But deep down, something had shifted. I didn't laugh about it anymore. Over the next 2 months, my colleagues started avoiding me. Emails I sent would go unanswered for days, then receive terse replies that used to be warm and collaborative. My name disappeared from project invitation lists. Meetings I should have been in happened without me, decisions made in my absence. Mason called it restructuring, streamlining, making the team more agile. But I could see the quiet campaign behind his words, turning allies into skeptics, planting seeds of doubt about my contributions. "Elliot's been slowing us down," I overheard one afternoon, passing by Mason's office where the door stood slightly ajar. His voice was low, confident. Rehearsed like he'd practiced the line. "Great guy, solid worker, but he's not keeping up with the pace we need." I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to him poison my reputation with careful, strategic lies. Each word calculated to damage without being obvious, to undermine without leaving fingerprints. That night, I started saving everything. Every email, every draft document, every timestamp showing when I'd submitted work. I created folders within folders, backed everything up to my personal cloud storage. If this was war, I'd need evidence. Mason had charisma and position. I had truth and documentation. Time would tell which weapon proved stronger. The company's annual investor gala happened in early December at the Meridian Hotel downtown. 300 people filled the ballroom, investors in expensive suits sipping wine while Mason worked the room like a politician running for office. I stood at the edge of the crowd, clapping when appropriate, smiling when people glanced my way. Mason told stories about his instincts, his vision, his ability to see opportunities others missed. Every anecdote was actually about deals I'd identified and closed, but the pronouns had all changed from we to I. When the lead investor from Vanguard Investments, a woman named Olivia Pierce, raised her glass in a toast, her words made my stomach turn. To Mason Corrick, the dealmaker who's transformed Glenrock's portfolio. Everyone cheered. Mason nodded graciously, then walked over and patted my shoulder in front of the crowd. "This guy keeps my spreadsheets clean," he said, loud enough for nearby investors to hear. The laughter that followed felt like glass scraping down my throat. I maintained my smile, nodded along, played the role he'd assigned me. Just a spreadsheet guy, nothing more. That night, driving home alone while Mason celebrated with investors at an afterparty I wasn't invited to, I felt something inside me turn cold and purposeful. I started a folder on my home computer that night. Named it Project_Truth and filled it systematically, methodically, the way I approached every analysis. Screenshots of emails where I'd first proposed deals Mason later claimed as his ideas. Original drafts of presentations showing my authorship in the metadata. Contract versions displaying my signature and submission timestamps. Every lie Mason told got backed up by one of my files. Every credit he took was countered by documentation proving otherwise. The folder grew week by week, a complete record of theft disguised as leadership. He didn't know it yet, but every step he took toward greater success was actually one step closer to the edge of a cliff I was carefully documenting. Each promotion, each accolade, each investor dinner where he basked in praise for my work, all of it was building a case he couldn't see coming. I worked on the folder late at night after Claire went to bed, cross-referencing dates, organizing evidence, making sure every claim I might eventually make could be supported with proof. No emotions, no anger-driven accusations. Just cold, hard facts that couldn't be disputed. Mason had taught me something valuable over these months. The person who controls the narrative controls reality. I was about to take that narrative back. I finally confronted him after a quarterly review meeting. Caught him alone in the hallway outside the conference room, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Mason, why did you take my name off the Harland contract?" He turned, and for just a second, I saw calculation flash across his face before his expression settled into practiced concern. "Elliot, if you were more of a team player, you'd understand that credit isn't individual. We succeed together. But you presented it as your solo achievement." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to something almost friendly, almost threatening. "If you make this an issue, if you start pointing fingers and causing problems, I'll make sure you don't work in finance again. This is a small industry. Reputation is everything." The threat hung between us, clear and undeniable. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The mask had slipped enough for me to see the calculation underneath. I left without another word, walking back to my office on autopilot. But something inside me had clicked into place, cold and certain. Now I knew exactly what I was fighting. Not a misunderstanding or office politics gone wrong. I was fighting someone who'd actively destroy me to protect his stolen success. The war had officially begun. Mason just didn't realize he'd already lost it. The weeks that followed felt like slow suffocation. My workload doubled while my authority evaporated. Projects I'd started were reassigned to junior analysts who'd look at me with pity or confusion. Mason started CCing me on emails only after decisions had been made, making me a spectator in my own career. The interns I'd been mentoring were redistributed to other departments. My office was moved to a smaller space near the supply room, officially labeled as a temporary accommodation during renovations that never seemed to start. Every change was small enough to seem reasonable, but together they painted a clear picture of systematic marginalization. I watched Mason enjoy the rewards of my labor while feeling my purpose hollow out day by day. He wore suits I could never afford, drove a car the company leased for him, took clients to restaurants where my salary wouldn't cover an appetizer. Every story needs a villain, and I'd found mine. The tragedy was that he wore my suit size, worked in my field, and had once been someone I'd respected. Now he was just the man slowly burying my career while smiling and calling it progress. But I kept showing up, kept documenting, kept building my case. Patience, I'd learned, was a weapon Mason had never bothered to master. The breaking point came during an all-hands video call in March. The entire company logged in from home offices and conference rooms to hear Mason present the quarterly forecast. I sat alone in my apartment, Claire working in the next room, watching my boss present my market analysis as his own insight. The slide deck was mine. Every chart, every projection, every strategic recommendation, I'd built it over 6 weeks of research and modeling. I'd submitted it to Mason 3 days earlier, clearly marked with my name in the file properties. Now it appeared on screen with no attribution except Mason's confident narration. When someone in the chat asked, "Who made this forecast?" Mason replied without hesitation, "Our analytics team under my direction. I'm proud of the methodology we've developed. Our analytics team. My direction. We've developed." The chat exploded with praise emojis and congratulations. Someone wrote, "This is why we trust your leadership, Mason." I closed my laptop slowly, carefully, like I was handling something fragile. Sat in the silence of my apartment while Claire typed in the other room, while the world continued spinning like nothing had happened. "He just fired himself," I whispered to the empty room. "He just doesn't know it yet." That afternoon, I printed everything. Not digital backups this time, but physical evidence. Internal memos showing my project assignments. Quarterly reports with my analysis. Deal memos bearing my signature and submission timestamps. Metadata printouts proving file authorship. Each document went into a manila folder, then into a larger box. Each piece of evidence was a nail in Mason's coffin, though he was still walking around thinking himself invincible. I drove to my bank and rented a safety deposit box, something I'd never needed before. The clerk walked me through the process, and I placed the box of evidence inside the small metal drawer. If Mason tried to burn the house down, to delete files or rewrite history, I'd still have the blueprints proving how everything was actually built. Claire found me that evening sitting on our porch, staring at nothing. "You're going to do something," she said, not a question. "I'm going to let him do something," I corrected. "I'm just going to make sure everyone sees it clearly." She kissed the top of my head and went back inside. She'd been watching this slow-motion betrayal for months, had held me through nights when the injustice felt suffocating. She understood that revenge wasn't about striking back. Sometimes it was about stepping aside and letting someone's own actions destroy them. My former mentor, Jim Alder, the retired CFO who'd hired me 6 years ago, called on a Thursday evening. His voice carried the weight of bad news before he even said the words. "Elliot, I've heard rumors through my network. Mason's been blaming you for last quarter's dip in investor confidence." I almost laughed, bitter and sharp. The dip he caused by ignoring my risk assessment? "Yes, that one." Jim sighed heavily. "He's setting you up to take the fall. The board's looking for a scapegoat, and he's serving you up on a silver platter. You need to protect yourself." After we hung up, I sat with that information, letting it sink in. Mason wasn't just trying to erase me or steal credit anymore. He was preparing a public execution, turning me into the reason for every problem while positioning himself as the solution. The game had escalated beyond career theft into active sabotage. He'd gone from taking credit for my successes to blaming me for his failures. The cruelty of it was almost impressive. But I'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every file saved, every email backed up, every piece of evidence stored away, it had all been building toward this. Mason thought he was 10 steps ahead. He didn't realize I'd been running a different race entirely. Friday morning arrived with an email from HR. "Elliot, we need to schedule a performance discussion at your earliest convenience." I knew what that meant. Performance discussion was corporate speak for termination meeting. I replied that I could meet at 2 o'clock that afternoon, then spent the morning backing up files to one more location, making sure nothing could be lost or deleted. Angela from HR greeted me outside the conference room with the pained expression of someone who hated her job today. Inside, I found papers already printed and stacked, a script already written. This wasn't a discussion. It was theater. "Elliot, we've noticed several inconsistencies in your work," Angela began, reading from notes. "Project delays, communication breakdowns, performance metrics that don't meet expectations." Mason walked in mid-meeting, perfectly timed to seem surprised. "Oh, I didn't realize this was happening today." His voice dripped with false concern. "Elliot, I didn't want it to come to this." Every word was scripted. Every pause calculated. He'd choreographed this performance weeks ago, maybe months. I was just the actor who didn't know he was playing a part in his own firing. They slid papers across the table. Performance improvement plan. Written warnings I'd never received. Documents I'd never seen. I signed nothing. Just sat quietly, listening to them dismantle my career with lies I could disprove in my sleep. Let them think they'd won. Let Mason believe his plan had worked perfectly. Security walked me out 30 minutes later. I kept my expression blank, my mind racing through the next steps. Mason's reflection appeared in the glass door as I passed, his posture screaming victory. But victory, I understood now, had an expiration date. And his had just been stamped with today's date. He thought removing me from the building meant removing me from the story. He didn't understand that I'd become the story itself, the ghost that would haunt every lie he'd told. The security guard, Marcus, who I'd always been kind to, carried my box to my car. "Sorry, man," he said quietly. "This doesn't feel right." "It's not," I replied. "But sometimes wrong things have to happen before right things can fix them." He nodded like he understood, though I wasn't sure I understood it myself yet. I was operating on instinct now, on faith that truth had power if you knew when to deploy it. I drove home slowly, taking side streets, letting the reality sink in. Unemployed for the first time in 6 years. Fired for poor performance when I'd been carrying the company. Erased from the narrative I'd written. But I wasn't worried. Not anymore. The silence after a storm wasn't emptiness. It was the space where new things grew. A week passed. No calls from former colleagues. No job offers from competitors who'd once courted me. My phone stayed silent in ways that felt deliberate, orchestrated. Mason had been busy making calls, spreading his version of events, quietly blacklisting me across the industry. Claire watched me spend days on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and didn't push. She brought coffee, kissed my forehead, let me process. She'd seen me work myself to exhaustion for years. Maybe this forced pause was exactly what I needed. I spent nights staring at the folder on my computer, project_truth. The evidence sat there, complete and damning, waiting for the right moment. Not yet, I kept thinking. Not yet. Timing was everything. If I released it now, while the sting of my firing was fresh, it would look like revenge, like a disgruntled employee making accusations. But if I waited, let Mason's lies mature into something bigger, let him feel completely safe in his victory, the fall would be that much more devastating. Patience wasn't just a virtue. It was strategy. And I'd always been good at strategy, even when people didn't notice. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after my firing. Forwarded from a contact who still worked at Glenrock, marked FYI with no additional commentary. Subject line, Investor Review announced for Glenrock Capital. My heart skipped as I read. Following recent performance discrepancies and questions about attribution of successful deals, Vanguard Investments, our largest investor group, had requested an independent audit. They wanted to verify deal authorship, review internal communications, examine the paper trail behind every major profitable transaction. Mason must have been panicking, though he'd hidden it well. His LinkedIn post that afternoon talked about transparency and growth, about welcoming scrutiny because great companies had nothing to hide. His words read confident, but I could see the fear underneath them. The audit team wouldn't miss what he'd buried. They'd find my name on documents he'd claimed, my analysis in presentations he'd delivered, my signatures on contracts he'd taken credit for. Every lie he'd told was about to be examined by forensic accountants who specialized in finding exactly these kinds of discrepancies. I closed my laptop and actually smiled. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. The machinery of truth had started moving, and nothing Mason could do would stop it now. I composed the email carefully, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee growing cold beside me. No name, no obvious identifying information. Just a subject line, "For your review, deal authorship records." The body was brief. Attached you'll find documents showing the original authorship and development of Glenrock Capital's major profitable deals over the past 18 months. File metadata and timestamps verify authenticity. I trust you'll find this information relevant to your audit. I attached everything. Every original document, every email chain, every piece of evidence from my project_truth folder. Sent it to the audit team's general inquiry email, the one listed on Vanguard's website for their forensic accounting division. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute. This was the point of no return. Once I pressed it, the truth would be out there, moving through channels I couldn't control. Mason would eventually know someone had provided documentation. He might even suspect me. But suspicion wasn't proof. And unlike him, I'd left no fingerprints to trace back. I hit send and closed my laptop. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up angry. The evidence was no longer just mine to carry. It belonged to people who had the power to do something with it. 3 days later, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, tired of recruiters and spam calls. Something made me pick up on the fourth ring. "Mr. Brandt? This is Olivia Pierce from Vanguard Investments. I'm leading the audit of Glenrock Capital. I was hoping we could speak about your work there." My pulse spiked. I kept my tone calm, professional. "Of course. I'm happy to help however I can." There was a pause, then her voice came through quieter, more personal. "I've spent the last 72 hours reviewing documents related to Glenrock's profitable deals. It seems every major successful transaction traces back to you, your analysis, your client relationships, your financial models. Would you be open to discussing your methodology?" I realized in that moment what was happening. The audit wasn't just finding discrepancies. It was finding me, my work, my fingerprints all over the success Mason had claimed as his own. "Yes," I said simply. "I'd be very open to that discussion." We scheduled a meeting for the following week. After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone for 10 minutes, processing what had just begun. The truth was surfacing, exactly as I'd planned. But actually hearing it validated by someone with power felt surreal. The machinery I'd set in motion was working. Now I just had to let it run. Inside Glenrock, according to the friend who still sent me occasional updates, chaos was brewing. The audit team had set up in a conference room, requesting files, interviewing employees, following paper trails Mason thought he'd covered. Mason scrambled to explain missing documents and mismatched signatures. First he blamed interns for filing errors. Then he pointed to department heads for miscommunication. Each excuse sounded reasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone desperately deflecting. The audit trail didn't lie. Each document, when examined closely, led back to the same origin, E. Brandt. My employee ID on the original files. My submission timestamps predating Mason's presentations by days or weeks. My signature on contracts that had later been reprocessed with his name prominent. Every lie was unraveling like thread pulled from his expensive tailored suit. The harder he tried to hold the story together, the faster it fell apart. Junior employees who'd been blamed started defending themselves, producing their own documentation showing they just followed Mason's orders to rebrand my work. The house of cards was collapsing. Mason had built his success on stolen credit, and stolen credit, it turned out, left a very clear paper trail for anyone who cared to look. And Vanguard Investments cared very much about looking. The email from Olivia Pierce came on a Thursday afternoon. "Elliot, we're presenting our audit findings to Glenrock's board on Monday at 2 p.m. Given your central role in the deals in question, we'd like you present if you're willing. You have a right to hear what we've found." A right to hear. The phrasing felt significant, loaded with implication. They weren't asking me to defend myself. They were inviting me to witness vindication. Monday arrived clear and cold. I dressed in my best suit, the navy one I'd worn to important client meetings back when those meetings had my name attached to them. Claire straightened my tie and kissed my cheek. "Go get your truth back," she said. The conference room at Glenrock felt surreal to walk into. Familiar faces around the table, board members I'd presented to dozens of times. And Mason, sitting at the head, face pale but composed. When he saw me walk in and take a seat beside Olivia and her audit team, the color drained completely. His mouth opened slightly. Closed. Opened again. No words came out. Olivia began speaking, her voice calm and professional. "Our findings indicate that all major profitable transactions at Glenrock Capital over the past 18 months originated from Elliot Brandt's analysis and client relationship development." Mason's voice cracked as he tried to interrupt. That's impossible. I led those deals. Everyone here knows." "No, Mason." I spoke for the first time, meeting his eyes across the table. "That's documented." The presentation continued for 90 minutes. Olivia walked through each major deal, showing original documents with my name, then the versions presented to investors with Mason's name. Side-by-side comparisons that made the theft undeniable. Metadata proving I'd created files days or weeks before Mason presented them. Email chains where I'd proposed deals, developed strategies, then watched Mason present those exact strategies as his own ideas. Time-stamped submissions showing my work entering the system, then mysteriously being reassigned to Mason's project portfolio. The board members' expressions shifted from confusion to understanding to anger. One of them, an older woman named Patricia who'd always been kind to me, looked at Mason with open disgust. "You fired him for poor performance," she said slowly. "The same week you presented his market forecast as your own work." Mason tried to respond, but his words tangled. The lies he'd told so smoothly for months suddenly didn't fit together anymore. Each excuse contradicted the last. His carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. By 4 o'clock, the board suspended Mason pending further investigation. Withdrew their support for his leadership. Began discussing potential legal action for fraud and misrepresentation. Mason tried to speak to me afterward in the parking lot, but I walked past without a word. There was nothing left to say. His downfall had written itself. I just made sure everyone could read it clearly. Olivia called 2 days later. "Elliot, Vanguard is forming a new investment fund focused on mid-market acquisitions. We need someone who actually understands value assessment and client relationships. Someone with integrity who does the work instead of taking credit for others' work. We'd like you to lead it." I hesitated, the offer too good, too fast. "Why me?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because you did the work while someone else took the credit. Because you documented everything instead of just complaining. Because when you had every reason to burn bridges, you let the truth speak for itself. That's the kind of integrity we invest in, Elliot." Literally. The salary she named was triple what Glenrock had paid me. The title came with real authority, real autonomy. A corner office and a team I'd build from scratch, based on talent instead of politics. For the first time in months, the air felt light. Not because Mason had fallen, but because I was being seen clearly. My work, my value, my contribution, all of it finally visible to people who mattered. "I'm interested," I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. "Very interested." That evening, Claire and I celebrated with cheap wine and expensive takeout. She raised her glass. To truth being patient. I clinked my glass against hers. To truth being inevitable. News broke the following week. Mason Corrick resigns from Glenrock Capital for personal reasons. The press release was carefully worded, no mention of fraud or investigation. Just the usual corporate language about pursuing new opportunities and spending time with family. But the financial industry is small. Word spread through networks that Vanguard had conducted an audit, that Mason's entire portfolio of successes had been someone else's work, that he'd systematically stolen credit and fired the person he'd stolen from. Glenrock stock dipped 10% in 2 days. Several clients requested to move their accounts. The board sent a quiet email to key investors thanking me for my unintentional transparency during the audit process. I didn't respond. Some victories didn't need acknowledgement. They just needed to exist. Mason's LinkedIn went silent. His posts about vision and leadership disappeared. I heard through networks that he'd taken a job at a much smaller firm, stripped of the prestige he'd built on borrowed success. Not fired exactly, but permanently diminished. I didn't feel triumphant. Didn't feel the rush of revenge. Just felt a quiet sense of balance restored. The universe had corrected itself. My role had been simply to document the truth clearly enough that correction became inevitable. Some victories are silent. Some are simply freedom. This was both. 6 months later, I drove past the old Glenrock office one last time. Same glass walls. Same parking lot where I'd been escorted out like a criminal. Same building where I'd built my career and watched it stolen from me. Only difference, I wasn't trapped inside anymore. I was heading to my new office across town, to the team I'd built based on merit instead of politics, to work that had my name on it because I'd actually done it. My voice, if this were narrated, would be soft but certain. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's letting the truth echo long after you stop speaking. I smiled, pulling into traffic, leaving Glenrock behind for the last time. Because in the end, I didn't destroy Mason. He destroyed himself. I just made sure everyone saw it clearly. The theft, the lies, the systematic erasure of my contributions, all of it had been his choice. My choice had been simpler: document everything, wait for the right moment, let truth do the heavy lifting. Mason thought he could rewrite history because he controlled the narrative. But he'd forgotten that history leaves receipts. Every email, every file, every timestamp was a piece of truth he couldn't edit away. The victory wasn't in watching him fall. The victory was in standing up, dusting myself off, and building something better from the ashes of what he tried to destroy. Vanguard didn't hire me out of pity. They hired me because my work spoke for itself once people actually looked at it. As I parked at my new building, looking up at the windows where my team was already working, I realized something profound. Mason had done me a favor. Not intentionally, but in forcing me out of Glenrock, he'd freed me from a place that valued politics over performance. Now I worked somewhere that valued what I'd always valued: doing good work, treating people fairly, letting results speak louder than posturing. I walked inside to start my day, carrying nothing from the past except the lesson it taught me. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be documented clearly enough that when people finally look, they can't miss it. And when they look, when the light finally shines on what's real instead of what's claimed, justice doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It just quietly corrects the record. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.